You see these socks? Oh. Hey guys, welcome back. Have you ever noticed how the topic of sex comes up in your life? I mean, in the music we listen to, the videos we watch, the movies we go and see, and the conversations around the lunch table, the subject of sex gets a lot of attention in our world. Maybe you've had a moment in your own life when you suddenly realized that everyone was talking about sex. And not only was everyone talking about it, but it seemed like they were talking about sexual stuff like it wasn't that big of a deal. Honestly, sex and sexual activity seem like casual parts of our world. Now, before we get too far in this conversation, let's clarify what I mean by these terms. Sex is the physical act of sex, whereas sexual activity is anything that expresses someone's sexuality. It can be things like kissing or touching others in a sexual way, but it can also include sex. So when you hear me say sexual activity in our conversation today, it means any act with someone that's sexual in nature. And like I was saying, in our culture, we hear about sexual activity so often and in so many ways that it just seems like it's not that serious or important. Maybe your parents talk about it like it's not that big of a deal. Or maybe they say it's a big deal, but they do something in their own lives that demonstrates the opposite. Maybe some of your friends talk about sex and sexual activity all the time. Whether they're talking about their own experiences, making jokes, or simply asking questions, it's always a topic of conversation. Maybe you've noticed lately how often the topic comes up in the music you listen to, the shows and movies you watch, and the books you read. They all seem to have sort of sexual content, don't they? Or maybe even your social media feed feels like a constant conversation about sex and sexuality. Whether it's the pictures people post, the comments they make, or even the things people say in their direct messages. It's as if people don't seem to think it's all that big of a deal. The reality of life today is that sexual activity is just a normal part of our culture's conversation. And maybe you're sitting there wondering why that is. Why is it that everyone talks about sexual things so casually? Well, I think there are a few answers to that question. For starters, I think a lot of times people talk about sexual things because they want to prove something. Maybe they think it makes them sound cool or grown up or experienced. Or maybe they talk about it because it makes them feel connected to someone else and not so lonely. Maybe they talk about sexual stuff because they're curious about it. It's something that seems off limits and honestly kind of exciting. So they talk about it simply to find out more about it. Or maybe to some people, sex is something that you absolutely should not do, so they talk about it negatively. No matter the reason it's talked about in your world, I think the biggest issue with sex being discussed so casually is this. Sex isn't as simple as the world says it is. Like we said before, the messages we get from our culture make touching another person's body seem like a casual thing. But the problem with this approach is that treating sexual activity casually hurts us more than we realize. Why? Because even though it's portrayed as not that big of a deal, all of these sexual actions are actually more powerful than we think. Paul, who is one of the key leaders in the early Christian church, wrote a letter to some people who lived in an ancient town called Corinth. The Corinthians lived in a culture that was a lot like ours. They talked about sexual things in a really casual way and treated them like they were no big deal. So Paul decided to write a letter to the Christians living in Corinth to encourage them to take a different approach. Here's what he wrote. Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. Paul meant business, didn't he? He started off by immediately telling the Christians in Corinth to run from sexual sin. But run from what exactly? Well, he meant for them to flee from anything that approached sexual activity in a way that was different from what God made it to be. To get away from the idea that being sexual with someone else was something that they could use, experiment with, and explore casually. I think it's interesting that Paul chose to use the word run in this verse. Not walk, not try and avoid it, not do their best to stay away from it, but like run, like take off running and don't look back. That's how seriously Paul wanted them to take his words. And it's the same advice Paul would give us today. We need to run from anything that would encourage us to treat sexual things and activities like they don't matter. Why? Because when we treat sex casually, we're hurting both others and ourselves. Paul said that no other sin, no other thing we can do that's outside of God's best for us will impact us the way sexual sin does. Sex outside of God's design hurts us because it's not recognizing and honoring the value that God places in us. God created us for a purpose, as a reflection of his creativity, goodness, and love. When we don't follow his plan for our sexuality and we give in to sexual sin, we don't fully honor the masterpiece God created in each one of us. Some of you have probably experienced the impact of sexual sin in your lives. Maybe your parents' marriage fell apart because of an affair. Or maybe you know someone who has experienced a negative consequence from sex. Or maybe you're simply dealing with a lot of guilt and shame from the way you've treated sex or sexual activity in your thoughts or actions. But let me stop here and say that this verse isn't directed towards people who are victims of sexual abuse. If you've been abused, God doesn't hold you accountable for somebody else's sin. I'm so sorry that you've experienced living with the pain of sexual abuse in your life. That's not what God wants for you, and that's not part of His plan. And if you need someone to talk to about that, your small group leader is a great place to start. You see, what Paul was warning about in this verse was something that so many of us already know. When we treat sexual activity casually, we'll be hurt deeply. Paul understood how much sexual sin could impact our lives, and he wanted us to understand it clearly. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, deep down, we know Paul was right. We understand that our mistakes and regrets related to sexual activity are sometimes the hardest to get over. Here, let me show you something. Okay, so when we make choices that treat sex casually, we can start to head towards this area, toward sexual sin. We move toward the potential of being hurt or dealing with guilt or having to face negative consequences of our thoughts and actions. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, okay, that's great, but how do I know when I'm headed towards sexual sin? How far can I actually go with my thoughts and actions? Well, what I'd say to you is that if you're even asking questions like those, you're probably moving in a direction that God doesn't want you to head towards. See, here's what I think Paul wanted us to understand about this topic. Because God made sex, sexual things matter. Paul encouraged us to literally run from a casual approach to sexual activity and instead to embrace what God created it to be, something important that matters. And here's the cool part. When we run away from something, like sexual sin, we're also running towards something else. When we choose to run from sexual sin, we're also choosing to run towards sexual integrity. We're running toward making choices that are in line with God's plan when it comes to acting on and thinking about sexual things. And isn't God's best something worth running towards? I sure think so. Because God made sex, sexual things matter. And regardless of what the world around us wants us to think, this is the truth. When we start treating sexual activity like it matters, the way Paul encouraged us to see it, we're taking a step towards God's best for our lives. Now, at times, you may feel unsure about what area your thoughts and actions are falling into when it comes to sexual things. I totally get it. And we may or may not have had past experiences with this stuff up until this point. But what I do know is that no matter where we are now, we can all start to take steps that move us toward sexual integrity and away from sexual sin. First, we can run from the world's view. We can make choices that help us turn away from our culture's casual approach to sex. Maybe for some of us, that means changing the music we listen to, or the conversations that we're a part of, or the pictures we look at, or the YouTube videos we watch, or the links we click. Maybe for others of us, it's pausing to check the thoughts that run through our minds on a daily basis. Or maybe it's making a choice to change some behaviors that we've participated in that we know aren't God's best for us. No matter where you're at with this, the first thing you can do is make a choice to run from the world's casual view of sex. And instead, we can run towards God's plan for sexual things in our lives. In other words, we can run toward an approach that says sex was made to matter. Maybe that means setting boundaries when it comes to sexual activity in your relationships. Setting boundaries ahead of time, like not being alone with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or setting a limit that you won't pass sexually can help hold you accountable. Because when you're in the moment, it can be difficult to resist sexual sin. Or maybe for you, running towards God's plan for sex means paying attention to the messages about sex in the songs you listen to or the movies you watch. If those messages don't match God's best, it might be time to make a change. Or maybe it's simply asking someone like your small group leader to help you stay away from certain thoughts or behaviors. Whatever it is, remember that choosing to run towards God's best for your life, to move towards sexual integrity, is the best choice you can make for yourself, both now and later. Remember, because God made sex, sexual things matter. If you haven't been treating them this way, one of the best things about God is that He loves us no matter where we are in our lives. Because of that, it's never too late to make the choice to run from something and run towards Him instead. No matter how you've lived up until this point, from now on, you can choose to treat sex like God made it to matter. Listen, I get that this message may be difficult for some of us. I know it's hard to run from something the world seems to treat so casually. It's hard to do something different than everyone else around us. But when we do, we can trust that God has what's best in store for us. Choosing to run toward Him is a choice you'll never regret. So as you head out today, I want you to think about this question. What's one message about sex that I'm getting from the world around me?